Every day, the boy helped an old lady tend to her garden. But when her son arrived in a luxury car one morning, their jaws dropped at his announcement. Marcus's feet hurt in his too small sneakers as he rushed past the row of houses on Pine Street. The morning sun beat down on his neck, and sweat already darkened the collar of his white school shirt. He clutched his worn backpack straps tighter, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "I'm gonna be late again," he muttered, picking up his pace. The memory of this morning's conversation with his mother still rang in his ears. She had been standing at their small kitchen counter, packing his lunch with hands rough from years of cleaning other people's houses. "Marcus, baby, remember what I always tell you," she'd said, placing an apple next to his sandwich in the brown paper bag. "We might not have much, but we've got something money can't buy." "I know, Mom." Dignity and kindness, Marcus had finished for her, managing a tired smile. He'd heard these words hundreds of times before. "That's right." She'd smoothed down his collar, her touch gentle despite her calloused fingers. "And don't you ever forget it. Now hurry up. You don't want to be late for school again." Now, as Marcus jogged past the familiar houses, he slowed down near number 42, Pine Street. It was hard not to notice this house. It stood out like a bright painting among the other worn-down buildings. The front yard exploded with colors: red roses, purple delphiniums, yellow daffodils, and dozens of other flowers Marcus couldn't name. And there she was again, just like every morning, the old white-haired lady in her garden. Mrs. Eleanor, he'd heard the neighbors call her. Usually, she moved through her garden with purpose, but today something was different. She stood bent over a large bag of soil, trying to lift it. Her arms shook with the effort, and Marcus could see her face turning red. He checked his watch again. 7:45 a.m. School started at 8 o'clock. Mrs. Eleanor attempted to lift the bag again, but it slipped from her fingers, spilling some soil on her feet. She let out a frustrated sigh that Marcus could hear from the sidewalk. His mother's words echoed in his head. Dignity and kindness. Marcus's feet stopped moving before his brain made a conscious decision. He stood there for a moment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, watching the old lady struggle again with the bag. "Excuse me." His voice came out smaller than he intended. Do you need help with that?" Mrs. Eleanor straightened up slowly, squinting at him through wire-rimmed glasses. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She wore a faded green shirt with dirt stains on the sleeves and old jeans with patches on the knees. "Oh." She seemed surprised to see him there. "Why, hello, young man. Shouldn't you be heading to school?" Marcus nodded, still standing at the gate. "Yes, but I saw you trying to lift that bag, and—" He gestured vaguely at the soil bag. "I could help, if you want." Mrs. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Marcus felt his palms start to sweat, and not just from the heat. Maybe this was a bad idea. Maybe she didn't want help from a strange kid, especially a... "That would be very kind of you," she said, interrupting his thoughts. Her face broke into a warm smile that made the corners of her eyes crinkle. "But only if you're sure. I wouldn't want you to be late for school." Marcus was already opening the gate. "It's okay. I can run fast." He dropped his backpack by the fence and approached the soil bag. It was heavy, but he was used to helping his mother carry groceries and laundry baskets. With a grunt, he lifted it. "Where do you want it?" "Over by that flower bed, please." Mrs. Eleanor pointed to a freshly dug area near some rose bushes. "Careful not to strain yourself." Marcus carried the bag over, his arms burning with the effort. When he set it down, Mrs. Eleanor was right beside him with a pair of scissors to cut it open. "Thank you, young man. That would have taken me ages." She wiped her hands on her jeans. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor. And you are?" "Marcus." "Marcus Thompson." "Well, Marcus Thompson, you've saved these poor petunias from waiting another day to be planted." She gestured at some small flowers waiting in plastic containers. "Would you like to help me plant them?" Marcus glanced at his watch again. 7:52 a.m. He was definitely going to be late now. "Bye. I should probably—" "Of course. You need to get to school," Mrs. Eleanor said quickly. "Perhaps another time." Marcus looked at the petunias, then at his watch, then back at Mrs. Eleanor's kind face. He thought about what his mother always said about kindness being more important than anything else. "I can stay for a few minutes," he heard himself say. "Just to help plant them." Mrs. Eleanor's face lit up. Wonderful. Here, let me show you how to do it properly. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus learned how to dig holes the right size, how to carefully remove the petunias from their containers without damaging the roots, and how to pat the soil around them just firm enough. Not too tight, Mrs. Eleanor instructed. The roots need room to breathe and grow. By the time they finished planting the last petunia, Marcus's hands were covered in dirt, and the sun was high in the sky. It was well past 8 a.m. "Oh dear," Mrs. Eleanor said, noticing the time. "I've made you very late. Here, let me write you a note for your teacher." She hurried inside and came back with a piece of paper and a pen. As she wrote, Marcus picked up his backpack, trying not to get dirt on it. "Thank you for your help, Marcus," she said, handing him the note. "You know, I'm out here every afternoon if you'd ever like to learn more about gardening." Marcus nodded, already backing toward the gate. "Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor. The flowers look nice." He ran all the way to school, his lungs burning and his legs aching. When he finally reached his classroom, Mrs. Martinez was in the middle of a math lesson. "Marcus Thompson," she said, raising an eyebrow. "You're 30 minutes late." The whole class turned to stare at him. Marcus handed her Mrs. Eleanor's note, his dirty hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Martinez read it, her expression softening slightly. "Take your seat, Marcus. See me after class." As he slid into his chair, his friend Tommy leaned over. "Dude, where were you? And why are your hands all dirty?" Marcus looked down at his soil-stained fingers and smiled slightly. "I was helping someone with their garden." When he got home that afternoon, his mother was waiting for him, arms crossed. The school had called about his tardiness. "Marcus Thompson, you better have a good explanation for being late to school," she said, her voice stern but tired. Marcus told her everything, about Mrs. Eleanor, the soil bag, the petunias, and the gardening lesson. When he finished, his mother's expression had changed from stern to thoughtful. "You're still in trouble for being late," she said finally. "But I'm proud of you for helping that lady." She pulled him into a hug, then wrinkled her nose. "Now go wash up. You smell like dirt." That night, as Marcus lay in bed, he thought about Mrs. Eleanor's garden and her invitation to return. Despite the scolding he'd gotten and the extra homework Mrs. Martinez had assigned, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's walk to school. Just before he fell asleep, he made a decision. Tomorrow, he'd leave home 15 minutes earlier. That way, if Mrs. Eleanor needed help again, he wouldn't be late for school. Sometimes, he thought, his mother was right. Kindness was worth more than anything else. The next afternoon, Marcus stood at Mrs. Eleanor's gate, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. School had ended 15 minutes ago, and instead of heading straight home, his feet had carried him here. He watched Mrs. Eleanor kneeling by a flower bed, her white hair glowing in the afternoon sun. "You came back," she said without turning around. Her hands moved steadily, pulling weeds from between the flowers. "Yes." Marcus gripped his backpack straps tighter. I thought maybe you could use some help again." Mrs. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "I could always use help. But don't you need to be somewhere else?" "Mom doesn't get home from work until 6, Marcus said. "I usually just do homework in my room." "Well then," Mrs. Eleanor pushed herself up with a slight grunt, dusting off her knees. "Would you like to learn about deadheading roses?" "Dead? What?" She laughed, the sound warm and rich. "Deadheading. It means removing the old blooms so new ones can grow. Come here. I'll show you." For the next hour, Mrs. Eleanor taught Marcus how to identify spent blooms and cut them off at the right spot. His hands fumbled with the gardening shears at first, but she was patient, guiding his fingers to the correct angle. "There you go," she said as he successfully removed a brown rose head. "You're a natural." From the street, Mrs. Jenkins from number 38 walked past, slowing down to stare at them. Her eyes narrowed, and she clutched her purse tighter. Marcus pretended not to notice, but his shoulders tensed. "Don't mind her," Mrs. Eleanor said quietly. "Some people see shadows where there's only sunlight." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being the snip of shears and distant traffic. Then Mrs. Eleanor spoke again. "You know, my grandson used to help me in the garden." Her voice was soft, almost distant. "He loved the roses best." Marcus looked up from the rosebush he was working on. "Where is he now?" "He passed away 5 years ago. Car accident," She touched a rose petal gently. He was about your age. Marcus's throat felt tight. My dad died too. 3 years ago. Mrs. Eleanor's hand stilled. I'm sorry to hear that, Marcus. Mom says he got sick. Cancer. Marcus concentrated on cutting another dead rose head. Sometimes I forget what his voice sounded like. The funny thing about grief, Mrs. Eleanor said, moving to work beside him, is that it's like these roses. You have to trim away the dead parts to make room for new growth. But the original plant, those memories, they stay strong at the roots. A butterfly landed on the rosebush between them. Its wings a brilliant orange and black. Look, Mrs. Eleanor whispered. A monarch. They love the garden too. They watched it flutter from flower to flower until a voice broke the spell. Marcus? Baby, is that you? Marcus turned to see his mother standing at the gate, still in her cleaning uniform. Her face was a mix of concern and confusion. Mom, what are you doing home early? Mrs. Peterson canceled today's cleaning. She opened the gate slowly. When you weren't home, I got worried. Started asking neighbors if they'd seen you. Mrs. Eleanor straightened up, wiping her hands on her jeans. You must be Marcus's mother. I'm Eleanor Williams. Your son has been kind enough to help me with my garden. Marcus's mother approached cautiously, looking around at the flower beds. So this is where you've been spending your afternoons? Yes, Marcus said quickly. Mrs. Eleanor's been teaching me about flowers. Look, I learned how to deadhead roses today. His mother's expression softened as she watched his excited demonstration with the shears. Mrs. Eleanor smiled, adding, he has quite a talent for it, and has been a tremendous help to these old bones. Well, his mother said slowly, I suppose as long as you've finished your homework. I did it during study hall, Marcus said, and I left early this morning so I wouldn't be late to school again. Mrs. Eleanor looked between them. Perhaps we could make an arrangement? Marcus could help me for an hour after school, then do his homework at my kitchen table? That way he's not alone at home, and these flowers get the care they need. Marcus held his breath, watching his mother consider the offer. She looked at the garden, at Mrs. Eleanor's kind face, at the gardening shears in Marcus's dirty hands. Finally, she nodded. That would be very kind of you, Mrs. Williams. Eleanor, please. Mrs. Eleanor beamed. And it's no trouble at all. In fact, she walked over to a small bed of colorful flowers. Marcus, would you help me cut some zinnias for your mother to take home? Together, they selected and cut a bright bouquet. As Mrs. Eleanor showed Marcus how to trim the stems at an angle so they drink better, more neighbors passed by. Some stopped to stare, others whispered to each other. One elderly man actually crossed to the other side of the street. Marcus's mother noticed. Her jaw tightened, but before she could say anything, Mrs. Eleanor spoke up. You know what I love about flowers, she said loudly enough for the onlookers to hear. They don't care what color the hands are that tend them. They bloom just the same. She handed the bouquet to Marcus's mother with a warm smile. Same time tomorrow, Marcus. Marcus looked hopefully at his mother, who was touching the zinnia petals with gentle fingers. She smiled. Same time tomorrow. That evening, as Marcus helped his mother put the zinnias in a vase, she asked, Did you really learn all those things about flowers today? Yeah. Mrs. Eleanor knows everything about gardens. Did you know you have to cut roses at a special angle? And some flowers need dead parts cut off so new ones can grow? And his mother laughed, pulling him into a hug. I haven't seen you this excited about something in a long time, baby. Marcus breathed in his mother's familiar scent, mixed now with the sweet fragrance of zinnias. Mom, do you think Dad would have liked gardening? She was quiet for a moment, still holding him. You know what? I think he would have loved it, especially seeing you so happy doing it. Later, as Marcus got ready for bed, he could hear his mother on the phone in the kitchen. Yes, sister, I checked her out. Asked around about Mrs. Williams. No, I'm not worried. You should see how Marcus lights up when he talks about that garden. I know, but sometimes kindness comes from unexpected places. Marcus looked out his window at the night sky. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had something to look forward to after school. Something that was just his. He fell asleep dreaming of roses and butterflies, his hands still smelling faintly of earth. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus's after-school gardening sessions with Mrs. Eleanor became as natural as breathing. Every day at 3:15 p.m., He pushed open the white gate, the metal hinges creaking their familiar welcome. Today, Mrs. Eleanor was already in her usual spot, humming as she worked on a new flower bed. She looked up at the sound of the gate, smiling as Marcus approached. "Right on time," she said, patting the ground beside her. "Ready to learn something new?" Marcus dropped his backpack by the fence and pulled on the gardening gloves Mrs. Eleanor had given him last week, his very own pair, with his name written on the cuff in permanent marker. "What are we planting today?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "These," she said, gesturing to a tray of delicate purple flowers, "are delphiniums. They're special ones, been in my family for generations. My grandmother brought the original seeds from England. They're pretty," Marcus said, gently touching a purple petal. "And tricky to grow," Mrs. Eleanor added. "But I think you're ready for the challenge." As they worked side by side, Mrs. Eleanor shared stories about her grandmother's garden in England. Marcus listened, carefully digging holes the exact depth she showed him. "Watch the spacing," she reminded him. "These beauties need room to grow tall and strong." A sharp voice cut through their peaceful afternoon. Well, what do we have here?" Marcus looked up to see Mrs. Jenkins and another neighbor he didn't know standing at the fence. Their faces wore identical expressions of disapproval. "Good afternoon, ladies," Mrs. Eleanor said without looking up. "Marcus, could you pass me that trowel?" Mrs. Jenkins leaned over the fence. "Eleanor, dear, are you sure it's wise to have him here every day? People are talking. Are they now?" Mrs. Eleanor's voice had turned cold as winter. She stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "And what exactly are they saying, Margaret?" The other neighbor stepped forward. "We're just concerned for your safety. A strange boy, always hanging around." "Strange?" Mrs. Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. "Marcus has been coming here every day for weeks. He knows more about my garden than anyone else in this neighborhood. He's learned every flower's name, every care requirement. He's helped me create the most beautiful garden I've had in years." She took a step toward the fence. "So no, he's not strange. He's extraordinary." Marcus felt his face grow hot. He stared at the ground, his hands clenched in his dirt-covered gloves. "But his—" Mrs. Jenkins started. "His what, Margaret?" Mrs. Eleanor's voice was sharp enough to cut steel. "Choose your next words very carefully." A tense silence followed. Then Mrs. Jenkins muttered something about just trying to help and hurried away, her friend following quickly. Mrs. Eleanor turned back to Marcus, her face softening. "I'm sorry you had to hear that, dear." "It's okay," Marcus mumbled. "I'm used to it." "Well, you shouldn't have to be." Mrs. Eleanor sat back down beside him. "Now, let me tell you about the time my grandmother caught the local vicar stealing her prize-winning roses." As she told the story, making Marcus laugh with her impression of the embarrassed vicar, a butterfly landed on one of the newly planted delphiniums. Then another. Soon, the garden was hosting a small gathering of butterflies, their wings flashing purple and orange in the afternoon sun. "They know," Mrs. Eleanor said softly. "They know this is a safe place." Later, as they were cleaning up their tools, Mrs. Eleanor asked, "Marcus, would you like to learn about some very special flowers?" She led him to a corner of the garden he hadn't worked in before. There, in a sheltered spot, grew flowers he'd never seen, delicate blooms in deep blues and purples, with intricate patterns on their petals. "These are rare orchids," Mrs. Eleanor explained. "They're incredibly difficult to grow in this climate. Most people said it couldn't be done, but," she smiled, "sometimes the most beautiful things grow in unexpected places." She showed him how to check their soil moisture, how to mist their leaves just right, how to support their delicate stems. Marcus absorbed every detail, treating each plant with the gentleness of handling a newborn. "Mrs. Eleanor," he asked as they finished, "how did you learn all this?" She sat on the nearby garden bench, patting the space beside her. As Marcus sat down, she pulled an old photograph from her pocket. It showed a much younger Mrs. Eleanor with a tall black man in gardening clothes. "This was Mr. Williams, my husband," she said. "He was the real gardener in the family. Worked as the head groundskeeper at the Botanical Gardens for 30 years. Taught me everything I know." Marcus studied the photo. Mr. Williams had kind eyes and soul-stained hands, just like Mrs. Eleanor. "The neighbors back then weren't any kinder than they are now," she continued. "But Joseph, Mr. Williams, he always said, Let them talk. We'll be too busy growing beauty to notice. She put the photo away carefully. That's what we're doing here, Marcus. Growing beauty. And don't let anyone tell you differently. The sun was starting to set when Marcus's mother came to pick him up. She brought them both glasses of lemonade, a new after-work routine she'd started. Look what Marcus planted today, Mrs. Eleanor said proudly, showing off the delphinium bed. They are gorgeous, his mother said, sipping her lemonade. Almost as pretty as those orchids you showed me yesterday, Marcus. Marcus beamed. His mother had been spending more time in the garden lately, sometimes joining them for a few minutes before heading home to start dinner. As they walked home that evening, Marcus's mother squeezed his shoulder. You're really blooming here, baby. I haven't seen you this confident in a long time. Mom, Marcus groaned at the pun. But he was smiling. That night, he dreamed of Mr. Williams tending his rare orchids, of butterflies dancing through delphiniums, of Mrs. Eleanor standing tall against prejudice. In his dream, the garden grew and grew until it covered the whole neighborhood in beauty. When he woke up, his new gardening gloves were on his bedside table, ready for another day of growing something beautiful. Dark clouds loomed over Pine Street as Marcus walked to Mrs. Eleanor's garden that afternoon. The air felt heavy, charged with something more than just the threat of rain. As he approached the familiar white gate, he heard voices, angry ones. You're making a mistake, Eleanor, a man's voice said. That boy has no business being here every day. Have you lost your mind? Marcus froze, his hand on the gate latch. Through the fence, he could see Mr. Peterson from 3 houses down standing in Mrs. Eleanor's garden path. His face was red with anger. I'll thank you to keep your opinions to yourself, Richard, Mrs. Eleanor replied, her voice steady but cold. Who I welcome into my garden is my business alone. It's the whole neighborhood's business when you're harboring Dash. Choose your next words very carefully. Mrs. Eleanor's voice could have frozen summer itself. That child has shown more kindness and dedication than anyone else on this street. Marcus's heart pounded. He should leave. Go home. Come back tomorrow. But his feet wouldn't move. Mr. Peterson jabbed a finger in Mrs. Eleanor's direction. You're naive, Eleanor. People are talking. What if things go missing? What if Dash? The only thing missing in this conversation is your dignity, Richard. Mrs. Eleanor drew herself up to her full height. Now get out of my garden before I call the police for trespassing. Mr. Peterson's face turned even redder. He opened his mouth to say something else, then spotted Marcus at the gate. His expression twisted into something ugly before he stormed past, deliberately bumping Marcus's shoulder on his way out. Mrs. Eleanor hurried to the gate. Marcus, dear, I'm so sorry you had to hear that. Marcus's throat felt tight. Maybe I should go home. Nonsense, Mrs. Eleanor said firmly. We have work to do. Those new rose bushes won't plant themselves. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the gate, but her voice was strong. Besides, there's rain coming. We need to get them in the ground before it starts. They worked in silence for a while, digging holes for the new roses. The air grew thicker, more oppressive. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Mrs. Eleanor. Marcus finally spoke, his voice small. Are you getting in trouble because of me? She set down her trowel and turned to face him. Marcus Thompson, look at me. She waited until he met her eyes. The only trouble in this garden is the small-mindedness of people who can't see past their own prejudices. You are not trouble. You are a blessing. A fat raindrop landed on Marcus's cheek. Then another. Quick, Mrs. Eleanor said. Help me get these last 2 roses planted before the storm hits. They worked faster as the rain began to fall more steadily. Just as they patted down the soil around the final rose bush, the sky opened up completely. Mrs. Eleanor grabbed Marcus's hand and they ran to her back porch, laughing despite everything. Look at us, she chuckled, wringing water from her shirt. Like a couple of drowned rats. Marcus started to smile, but then he saw Mrs. Eleanor sway slightly, grabbing the porch railing for support. Mrs. Eleanor. Alarm shot through him. Are you okay? Just a bit dizzy, she said, her face pale. Been happening on and off today. Nothing to worry about. But Marcus was already helping her to the porch chair. I'll call my mom. No, Mrs. Eleanor protested weakly. She's at work. I just need to rest a minute. Marcus ignored her, pulling out his phone. His mother answered on the second ring. Baby? What's wrong? Mom, Mrs. Eleanor's sick. She got dizzy and she's really pale and dash. I'll be right there. 20 minutes later, Marcus's mother arrived with their neighbor Mrs. Washington, who was a nurse. They found Mrs. Eleanor still sitting on the porch, Marcus hovering anxiously nearby with a glass of water he'd insisted she drink. Mrs. Washington checked Mrs. Eleanor's blood pressure and asked her several questions. Probably just dehydration and too much sun, she concluded. But you should take it easy for a day or two. The garden dash, Mrs. Eleanor started to protest. We'll be fine, Marcus's mother interrupted. Marcus can handle it. Mrs. Eleanor looked at Marcus. Would you? Just the basic watering and checking on things. Yes. Marcus straightened his shoulders. I remember everything you taught me. The next afternoon, Marcus stood alone in Mrs. Eleanor's garden. It felt strange without her there, but he knew what needed to be done. He checked the soil moisture in each bed, just as she'd taught him. Watered the demanding orchids with exactly 3 spritzes each. Removed dead leaves and spent blooms. Some neighbors walked by, whispering when they saw him working alone. One woman actually stopped and stared until Marcus felt his skin prickle. Can I help you? He asked, trying to sound as confident as Mrs. Eleanor. The woman hurried away without responding. Marcus turned back to the flowers, his hands shaking slightly. Let them talk, he muttered to himself. We'll be too busy growing beauty to notice. He worked until sunset, making sure everything was perfect for Mrs. Eleanor's return. As he was cleaning up the tools, he heard the gate open. Well, it was Mr. Peterson again, with Mrs. Jenkins beside him. Just as we suspected, taking advantage as soon as she's not here to watch you. Marcus's heart raced, but he remembered Mrs. Eleanor's straight spine, her unwavering voice. He stood up slowly. I'm taking care of the garden while Mrs. Eleanor rests, he said, proud that his voice didn't shake. She trusted me to do it. Trusted you? Mr. Peterson sneered. More like you fooled that poor old woman into dash. Is there a problem here? Marcus had never been so glad to hear his mother's voice. She stood at the gate in her cleaning uniform, her expression fierce. We were just dash, Mrs. Jenkins started. Just leaving, Marcus's mother finished for her. Unless you'd like me to call Mrs. Eleanor? Or maybe the police. I'm sure they'd be interested in why you're harassing a 12-year-old boy. They left quickly, muttering under their breath. Marcus's mother wrapped him in a tight hug. You okay, baby? Marcus nodded against her shoulder. The garden looks good, right? I did everything like Mrs. Eleanor showed me. His mother looked around at the well-tended flowers. It looks beautiful. You've learned it well. That evening, they visited Mrs. Eleanor. She was sitting up in her living room, looking much better. Her face lit up when Marcus gave her a detailed report of everything he'd done in the garden. Perfect, she said, squeezing his hand. I knew I could count on you. As they walked home, Marcus was quiet. What's wrong, baby? His mother asked. Maybe. He hesitated. Maybe I should stop going to Mrs. Eleanor's. People are giving her trouble because of me. His mother stopped walking and turned him to face her. Marcus Thompson, listen to me. Mrs. Eleanor chooses to have you there. She chooses to teach you, to trust you with her garden. Don't let anyone take that choice away from her, or from you. Marcus thought about the garden, about the rare orchids and the new roses, about Mrs. Eleanor's stories and gentle teachings. He thought about Mr. Williams and his philosophy about being too busy growing beauty to notice the ugliness. Okay, he said, I won't quit. That night, as he lay in bed, Marcus could hear his mother on the phone again. No, sister, I'm not worried about what the neighbors think. You should see him standing up for himself now. That garden, it's growing more than just flowers. Marcus smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow, Mrs. Eleanor would be back, and together they would keep growing beauty, no matter what the neighbors said. News spread through Pine Street like wildfire. Mrs. Eleanor's garden had been nominated for the annual Pine Grove Garden Competition. The same neighbors who had whispered and stared now slowed their walks past the white fence, eyes lingering on the riot of colors and perfectly maintained beds. Can you believe it? Mrs. Eleanor said one afternoon, showing Marcus the official nomination letter. They say it's the best garden they've seen in years. Marcus beamed with pride. He knew every inch of this garden now, every flower's name, every special care requirement. His hands had helped nurture many of these blooms. When are the judges coming? He asked, carefully deadheading a row of dahlias. Next week. Mrs. Eleanor adjusted her sun hat. which means we have work to do. Those new hybrid tea roses need special attention. They work side by side, the routine familiar now. Marcus noticed Mrs. Eleanor kept checking her phone, something she rarely did while gardening. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Oh, yes." She tucked the phone away quickly, just waiting for an important call. Before Marcus could ask more questions, he heard his mother's voice at the gate. "Look at my two favorite gardeners." She had started dropping by more often during her breaks between cleaning jobs, bringing them cold lemonade or fresh water. Today, she carried a small paper bag. "I brought cookies," she announced, coming into the garden. "Made them fresh this morning." Mrs. Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Sarah, you shouldn't have." Marcus's mother waved away the protest. "Least I could do. This garden, it's become special to all of us." She settled on the garden bench, watching them work. Marcus noticed she seemed tired, but her smile was genuine as she observed him expertly pruning the roses. "I never thought I'd see my boy so passionate about something," she said softly to Mrs. Eleanor. "After his father passed, well, he kind of withdrew into himself." Mrs. Eleanor nodded understanding. "Loss changes us, but sometimes it leads us to unexpected gifts." She looked at Marcus with fond pride. "Your son has a natural talent. These roses have never looked better." "Mrs. Eleanor's been teaching me about landscape design," Marcus added excitedly. "Did you know you have to think about things like color harmony and bloom times? And height variations and dash." He stopped, embarrassed by his outburst, but both women were smiling. "Tell me more," his mother encouraged. As Marcus explained the principles he'd learned, a small crowd gathered at the fence. But unlike before, their expressions held interest rather than suspicion. "Those orange lilies are gorgeous," one woman called out. "How do you keep them so healthy?" Before Mrs. Eleanor could answer, Marcus spoke up. "They need specific soil conditions, and you have to plant them in fall, not spring." The woman looked surprised, then impressed. "You certainly know your flowers, young man." More neighbors joined the conversation, asking questions about various plants. Marcus answered confidently, sharing the knowledge Mrs. Eleanor had passed on to him. Even Mrs. Jenkins, hovering at the back of the group, nodded approvingly at his explanations. Later, after the impromptu garden tour had dispersed, Mrs. Eleanor pulled out an old photo album. "I want to show you something," she said, patting the bench beside her. Inside were pictures of gardens, massive, elaborate gardens with fountains and winding paths. "These were my husband's designs," she explained. "He didn't just maintain the botanical gardens. He designed many of their featured exhibits." Marcus studied the photos in awe. "They are amazing." "He had a gift," Mrs. Eleanor said softly. "Like you do." She turned another page, revealing more stunning garden designs. "He always said that gardens are more than just plants. They are stories written in living color. Each flower, each path, each careful arrangement tells part of that story." Mrs. Eleanor's phone buzzed. This time, she answered it, walking a few steps away. Marcus could hear her voice rise with excitement. Yes, that would be perfect." "No, I think it's exactly right." When she returned, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Mrs. Eleanor, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, dear." She squeezed his hand. "Everything's exactly right." That evening, as Marcus and his mother walked home, they passed Mr. Peterson watering his lawn. To their surprise, he nodded at them. "Garden's looking good," he said gruffly. "Real good." Marcus's mother stumbled slightly in shock, but recovered quickly. "Thank you," she said coolly. As they continued walking, she whispered to Marcus, "See that, baby? Beauty changes things, changes people." At home, Marcus spread his homework on the kitchen table while his mother started dinner. The entire house smelled like the roses they'd cut for her to take home. "Mom," Marcus asked, looking up from his math problems, Do you think I could be a garden designer someday? Like Mr. Williams was?" His mother stopped stirring the pot on the stove and turned to face him. Her eyes were soft. "Baby, I think you can be anything you set your mind to." She came over and kissed the top of his head. "And from what I've seen in Mrs. Eleanor's garden, you've already got a head start." That night, Mrs. Eleanor called. Marcus could hear his mother's side of the conversation from his room. "Really? Oh my. Yes, he would love that. Are you sure? That's so generous." When she hung up, she came to his room, her face glowing with excitement. Mrs. Eleanor has something special planned, she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. But it's a surprise. You'll find out tomorrow. Marcus tried to get her to tell him more, but she just smiled and kissed him goodnight. In his dreams that night, he walked through endless gardens, each more beautiful than the last. In each one, he could see his own touch, a carefully placed flower here, a thoughtful color combination there. And in each garden, butterflies danced through the flowers, their wings carrying the colors of hope. Mrs. Eleanor was already on the phone when Marcus arrived the next afternoon. She paced the garden path, gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she quickly ended her call. Perfect timing, she said, tucking the phone away. We have important work to do today. The garden had never looked better. Every flower seemed to shine, every bed perfectly manicured. Even the air smelled sweeter than usual. Are you ready for the competition tomorrow? Marcus asked, pulling on his gloves. Almost. Mrs. Eleanor handed him a stack of small cards. But first, we need to label everything. The judges will want to know the names of all our varieties. They spent the next hour placing small identification cards near each plant variety. Marcus wrote the names in his best handwriting, scientific names and common ones, just as Mrs. Eleanor had taught him. Delphinium elatum, he muttered, carefully positioning a card. Bluebird variety. Perfect, Mrs. Eleanor said, beaming. You've learned so much. A car door slammed out front. Marcus looked up to see a sleek black Mercedes parked at the curb. A man in an expensive gray suit stepped out, checking his phone. Mrs. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her gardening apron. Right on time, she whispered. The man approached the gate, his polished shoes incongruous against the simple garden path. He was tall, with graying hair and Mrs. Eleanor's same sharp blue eyes. Mom, he said, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. Marcus froze. This was Mrs. Eleanor's son? James. Mrs. Eleanor straightened her spine. You're looking well. An awkward silence fell. The man, James, shifted his weight, looking around the garden. It's beautiful, Mom. Even better than the photos you sent. Thank you. Mrs. Eleanor's voice was carefully neutral. Marcus, dear, come meet my son. Marcus approached slowly, conscious of his dirt-stained clothes and worn sneakers. James's eyes widened slightly as he took him in. So this is Marcus, he said. Mom's told me a lot about you. Yes, sir, Marcus managed, wondering exactly what Mrs. Eleanor had said about him. James is a corporate lawyer in the city, Mrs. Eleanor explained. He doesn't visit often. Another uncomfortable silence descended. A butterfly fluttered between them, landing briefly on one of Marcus's identification cards before moving on. Mom, James started, then stopped. He took a deep breath. Mom, I've been thinking about what you proposed on the phone. Mrs. Eleanor's fingers twisted in her apron. And I think it's brilliant. A smile broke across his face, transforming it entirely. Actually, it's more than brilliant. It's exactly what Dad would have wanted. Mrs. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She stepped forward and, after a moment's hesitation, James hugged her. Marcus stood awkwardly, feeling like he was intruding on a private moment. He started to back away, but Mrs. Eleanor reached out and caught his hand. Stay, dear. This involves you too. James pulled a folder from his briefcase. I had the papers drawn up this morning. Everything's ready, just as you asked. Papers? Marcus asked, confused. Mrs. Eleanor squeezed his hand. Marcus, remember how I told you my husband, James's father, designed gardens? Marcus nodded. Well, he always dreamed of starting a program to teach young people about garden design, to pass on his knowledge, his love for creating beauty. She paused, emotion making her voice shake slightly. We're going to make that dream come true. James opened the folder. The Joseph Williams Memorial Gardening Program, he read, providing education and opportunities in landscape design and horticulture to young people in our community. Marcus's heart started beating faster. What does that mean? It means, Mrs. Eleanor said softly, that if you want, you'll be our first student. Professional classes, materials, mentoring, everything you need to learn garden design properly. Marcus stared at them both, unable to speak. James continued, Mom told me about your talent, your dedication, how you've helped transform this garden. She wants to invest in your future, And I agree completely. But, Marcus found his voice. But that must cost a lot of money. Money well spent, Mrs. Eleanor said firmly. James has helped set up a proper foundation. We'll be able to help many young people over the years. But you, Marcus Thompson, will be our first success story. Marcus felt tears burning his eyes. I need to call my mom. Already done, Mrs. Eleanor smiled. She'll be here any minute. As if on cue, Marcus's mother hurried through the gate. She must have left work early. She was still in her cleaning uniform. Did you tell him? She asked breathlessly. Mrs. Eleanor nodded. We just did. Marcus's mother pulled him into a tight hug. Oh, baby. This is such an amazing opportunity. Mom, Marcus whispered against her shoulder. Is it really okay? She pulled back to look at him. More than okay. It's perfect. James cleared his throat. There's more. Actually, he pulled out another paper. Mom mentioned you've been coming here after school, doing homework at her kitchen table. We thought maybe we could make that official. A proper after-school program, with tutoring available if you need it. A safe place to learn and grow. Marcus looked around the garden, his garden, in so many ways. At the flowers he'd helped plant and tend, at the beds he'd learned to design, at the beauty he'd helped create. Thank you, he managed to say. Thank you so much. Mrs. Eleanor hugged him, then his mother, then even James joined in. They stood there in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and dancing butterflies, united by something bigger than themselves. Later, as the sun began to set, Marcus helped Mrs. Eleanor prepare for tomorrow's competition. They worked in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Mrs. Eleanor, Marcus finally asked, did you plan all this? The program, everything? She smiled mysteriously. Let's just say I knew a good thing when I saw it. Just like these flowers. She touched a perfect rose bloom. Sometimes you have to nurture potential when you see it. Give it room to grow. Marcus looked at the garden, glowing in the evening light. Tomorrow, judges would walk these paths, admiring their work. But somehow, that seemed less important now. They'd already created something far more valuable than any competition could measure. Same time tomorrow, he asked, gathering his things. Same time tomorrow, Mrs. Eleanor confirmed. We have a lot of work ahead of us. Beautiful work. As Marcus walked home with his mother, his mind was already filling with garden designs, with dreams of creating beauty in unexpected places, just like Mr. Williams had done. His mother squeezed his shoulder. You know what your father would say about all this? Marcus looked up at her. What? She smiled, tears in her eyes. He'd say, look at my boy, growing something beautiful. The morning of the garden competition dawned bright and clear. Marcus had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of judges and programs and futures blooming like the flowers he'd helped tend. He arrived at Mrs. Eleanor's garden an hour earlier than usual, just as the morning dew was evaporating from the petals. Mrs. Eleanor was already outside, making last-minute adjustments to the flower beds. She wore a crisp blue dress instead of her usual gardening clothes, her white hair neatly styled. Good morning, she called out cheerfully. Ready for the big day? Before Marcus could answer, the purr of an expensive engine drew their attention. James's black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a smart business suit stepped out of the passenger's side, carrying a leather portfolio. Mom, James called out, opening the garden gate. This is Ms. Rodriguez from the foundation. She wanted to see the garden before the judges arrive. Ms. Rodriguez approached with confident steps, her heels clicking on the garden path. Her eyes scanned the flower beds professionally. Mrs. Williams, she said, extending her hand. Your son has told me so much about your garden and your vision for the program. Please, call me Eleanor. Mrs. Eleanor shook her hand warmly. And this is Marcus, our inspiration for the whole project. Ms. Rodriguez turned to Marcus, her expression curious. Ah yes, the young gardener I've heard so much about. She looked him up and down, taking in his worn clothes and eager face. James tells me you've learned quite a lot about garden design. Marcus straightened his shoulders. Yes, Mrs. Eleanor's been teaching me everything she knows. Everything his father taught her, James added quietly. Ms. Rodriguez opened her portfolio. Well, I'd love to see some of your work. James mentioned you've been involved in planning several of these beds. For the next hour, Marcus led Ms. Rodriguez through the garden, explaining their design choices, plant selections, and care routines. He showed her the rare orchids, proudly demonstrating the specific misting technique they required. He pointed out the color progressions in the flower beds, explaining how they planned for continuous blooming throughout the seasons. And these roses, he said, gesturing to his favorite bed. We planted them in a spiral pattern so that as you walk the path, you get different color combinations from every angle. Ms. Rodriguez made notes in her portfolio, her expression increasingly impressed. You certainly know your stuff, she said. Most adults don't understand design principles this well. A sleek white car pulled up outside the gate. Two people emerged, wearing badges that identified them as competition judges. Places, everyone, Mrs. Eleanor whispered excitedly. The judges introduced themselves as Mr. Chen and Mrs. Blackwood from the Pine Grove Horticultural Society. They carried clipboards and wore serious expressions. Mrs. Williams, Mr. Chen said formally. We've heard remarkable things about your garden. Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor replied. Marcus and I have worked very hard to prepare for today. Mrs. Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. Marcus, my assistant gardener, Mrs. Eleanor said proudly, putting a hand on Marcus's shoulder, has been instrumental in creating what you see here. The judges exchanged glances but said nothing as they began their inspection. They moved methodically through the garden, making notes and taking photographs. Marcus held his breath every time they paused to examine a flower bed he'd helped design. The color progression here is quite sophisticated, Mrs. Blackwood murmured, studying the delphinium bed. The plant spacing is remarkably precise, Mr. Chen added, measuring the distance between rose bushes. Marcus noticed Ms. Rodriguez watching the judges intently. She pulled James aside and whispered something that made him smile broadly. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the judges completed their circuit of the garden. They huddled together, comparing notes and whispering. Mrs. Blackwood cleared her throat. Mrs. Williams, we've seen many gardens in this competition, but none quite like this. Marcus's heart sank. Was that good or bad? The technical execution is flawless, Mr. Chen continued. The design principles are expertly applied. But what truly sets this garden apart is something else entirely. Oh! Mrs. Eleanor's voice was steady, but Marcus saw her hands trembling slightly. This garden has soul, Mrs. Blackwood said simply. Every bed tells a story. Every combination shows thought and care. It's not just beautiful, it's meaningful. Mr. Chen nodded in agreement. We'll announce the winners officially next week, but I think it's safe to say you'll be very pleased with the results. As the judges headed back to their car, Ms. Rodriguez stepped forward. I couldn't agree more about the soul of this garden, she said. And I think I speak for the foundation when I say we'd be honored to support your program. James beamed. Really? You're sure? Absolutely. Ms. Rodriguez turned to Marcus. Young man, you have a remarkable gift. With proper training and support, you could have a very bright future in landscape design. Marcus felt dizzy with joy. He looked at Mrs. Eleanor, who had tears in her eyes. See, she said softly. Sometimes you just have to give beauty a chance to grow. The sound of running feet made them all turn. Marcus's mother was hurrying through the gate, still in her cleaning uniform. Did I miss the judges? How did it go? Mom! Marcus ran to her. The foundation's going to support the program. And the judges love the garden. His mother hugged him tightly, then looked at Mrs. Eleanor and James. I don't know how to thank you both. No thanks needed, Mrs. Eleanor said firmly. Your son has earned this, every bit of it. James checked his watch. We should celebrate. Lunch, perhaps? My treat. As the adults discussed restaurant options, Marcus walked slowly through the garden. He touched the petals of the flowers he'd helped plant, remembered the lessons learned over each bed. From that first morning when he'd stopped to help with a heavy bag of soil, to this moment, everything had changed. A butterfly landed on his shoulder, its wings a brilliant orange against his blue shirt. Marcus smiled, thinking of all the times butterflies had appeared in the garden at important moments. Marcus! His mother called. Ready to go celebrate. He looked back at the garden one last time. The morning sun made every flower glow, every color sing. This wasn't just Mrs. Eleanor's garden anymore. It was their garden. And soon, through the program, it would help other kids discover their own gifts. Ready, he said, joining his family, both old and new, at the gate. As they walked to James's car, Marcus heard Mrs. Jenkins call out from her porch. "Congratulations, Marcus. We're all so proud of you." Marcus grinned. Yes, everything had changed indeed. The news of Mrs. Eleanor's garden winning first place in the competition spread through Pine Street like a sweet breeze. But the bigger news was the launch of the Joseph Williams Memorial Gardening Program, with Marcus as its first official student. On his first Saturday morning of formal training, Marcus arrived at the garden to find a small group waiting for him. Mrs. Eleanor sat on her porch with James and Ms. Rodriguez, while his mother stood proudly nearby. A new work table had been set up in the garden, covered with professional design materials. "Good morning, Marcus," Ms. Rodriguez said warmly. "Ready to begin your first official lesson?" Marcus nodded eagerly, taking in the fresh sketch pads, professional-grade colored pencils, and landscaping books spread across the table. "First," James said, holding up a package, "you'll need this." Inside was a crisp new set of navy blue coveralls with Joseph Williams Memorial Gardening Program embroidered on the back, and Marcus Thompson, student designer, on the front pocket. "Try them on," his mother encouraged, her eyes shining. The coveralls fit perfectly. Marcus stood a little straighter wearing them, feeling like a real professional. "Now, Ms. Rodriguez opened a large portfolio. "Mrs. Eleanor tells me you have a natural eye for design. Let's put that to the test." For the next 2 hours, Marcus learned about scale drawings, plant spacing calculations, and color theory. His hand cramped as he practiced drawing garden layouts, but he didn't mind. Every new concept felt like unlocking another secret of the garden world. "You're picking this up remarkably fast," Ms. Rodriguez noted as she reviewed his work. "Most students struggle with proportion in their first attempts, but yours are nearly perfect." Mrs. Eleanor beamed from her spot on the porch. "Just like his mentor," she said softly, touching the wedding ring she still wore. Around noon, more visitors arrived. A local newspaper reporter wanted to cover the launch of the program, and several neighbors gathered to watch. Even Mr. Peterson stood at the fence, his usual scowl replaced by genuine interest. "Can you show us what you're working on, Marcus?" the reporter asked, notebook in hand. Marcus explained his design for a new butterfly garden section, pointing out how he'd selected plants that would attract different species throughout the growing season. "The colors progress from cool to warm tones," he explained, gaining confidence as he spoke. "And the heights are arranged to create a natural flow, with tall flowers at the back and shorter ones in front." The reporter scribbled notes rapidly. "And how does it feel to be the first student in this program?" Marcus looked at Mrs. Eleanor, then at his mother. "It feels like finding something I was meant to do." "Is a natural," Mrs. Eleanor added. "Just like Joseph was." After the reporter left, Ms. Rodriguez presented Marcus with his official course schedule. 2 hours every Saturday for formal lessons, she explained, plus your usual after-school sessions with Mrs. Eleanor. "We'll cover everything from basic botany to advanced landscape architecture." And, James added, "when you're ready, you'll help design gardens for local community centers." Real projects, real experience. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he held the schedule. "Thank you," he managed. "I'll work really hard, I promise." "We know you will, baby," his mother said, squeezing his shoulder. Later that afternoon, as the excitement died down, Marcus worked alongside Mrs. Eleanor in their usual routine. Despite his new title and uniform, this was still his favorite part, hands in the soil, learning from her quiet wisdom. "Mrs. Eleanor," he asked as they planted new bulbs for next spring, "do you think Mr. Williams would have liked me being the first student?" Mrs. Eleanor sat back on her heels, considering the question. "Marcus, Joseph believed that gardens were for everyone. He fought his whole life against people who thought otherwise." She touched a flower petal gently. "He would have loved seeing you discover your gift for this work. And he would have been so proud of how you've helped make his dream come true." A butterfly landed on one of the newly planted bulb markers, its wings catching the afternoon sun. "You know," Mrs. Eleanor continued, "Joseph used to say that butterflies were signs of good luck in a garden. They only come to places where they feel safe and welcomed." She smiled at Marcus. "They've been coming here more and more since you arrived." Marcus looked around at the garden that had become his second home, at the flowers he'd helped plant and tend, at the designs he was learning to create, at the future blooming before him like a perfect rose. "I think," he said slowly, "that maybe I was meant to find this garden." Mrs. Eleanor patted his hand. "Or perhaps the garden was meant to find you." That evening, as Marcus and his mother walked home, they passed several neighbors working in their own front yards. Each one waved or called out greetings. "Those same people used to cross the street when they saw us coming," his mother said quietly. "The garden changed them," Marcus replied. "Like Mrs. Eleanor says, beauty changes things." At home, Marcus carefully hung his new coveralls in his closet. His mother watched from the doorway. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly. "He always said you were meant for something special." Marcus touched the embroidered name on the pocket. "I wish he could see this." "Oh, baby." His mother hugged him tight. "I think he can. I think he's been watching all along, seeing his boy grow into something beautiful." That night, Marcus dreamed of gardens. But this time, they weren't just any gardens. They were gardens he would design, places he would help create. In his dream, Mr. Williams stood beside him, nodding approval at his plans, while butterflies danced through the flowers they planted together. When he woke up, the first light of dawn was turning the sky the same color as Mrs. Eleanor's prize roses. Another Saturday, another lesson, another step toward the future that had started with one simple act of kindness. Marcus smiled. He couldn't wait to get started. 1 month after the launch of the Joseph Williams Memorial Gardening Program, Marcus stood in Mrs. Eleanor's garden, explaining the principles of color harmony to a small group of wide-eyed students. 5 local kids had joined the program after reading about it in the newspaper, and Marcus, as the senior student, had been asked to give them their first tour. "See how the purple delphiniums complement the yellow daffodils," he explained, gesturing to a bed he'd helped design. "That's called using opposite colors on the color wheel. It makes both flowers stand out more." Mrs. Eleanor watched from her porch, smiling proudly. She sat in her favorite chair, a light blanket over her knees despite the warm day. James stood beside her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "And these roses," Marcus continued, leading the group to his favorite bed. "They are planted in a special pattern. When you walk around them, you see different color combinations from every angle." "Did you design this?" one of the new students asked. A girl about Marcus's age named Sarah. "Mrs. Eleanor and I did it together," Marcus said. "She taught me everything I know about roses." After the tour, as the new students gathered around the work table to start their first lesson with Ms. Rodriguez, Marcus joined Mrs. Eleanor on the porch. "Well done," she said softly. "You're a natural teacher." "I just told them what you taught me," Marcus replied, but he couldn't hide his pleased smile. James checked his watch. "Almost time for the ceremony, Mom. Are you sure you're feeling up to it?" Mrs. Eleanor waved away his concern. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The ceremony was simple but meaningful. The mayor of Pine Grove had come to officially dedicate the garden as the new home of the Joseph Williams Memorial Gardening Program. A small bronze plaque would be installed by the gate. As people began arriving, neighbors, local officials, even some of Marcus's teachers from school, Marcus helped Mrs. Eleanor to her place of honor in the garden. His mother stood nearby, no longer in her cleaning uniform, but wearing a pretty dress she'd bought specially for the occasion. The mayor stepped forward to begin his speech. "Today, we celebrate more than just a beautiful garden," he said. "We celebrate the power of kindness, of mentorship, of giving young people the chance to grow and bloom." Marcus listened as the mayor told the story of how the program began. How a young boy had stopped to help an elderly woman with a heavy bag of soil. How that simple act had led to something bigger than either of them had imagined. "And now," the mayor continued, "I'd like to invite Marcus Thompson to say a few words." Marcus froze. No one had told him he'd need to speak. But Mrs. Eleanor squeezed his hand encouragingly, and his mother nodded, and somehow he found himself standing in front of everyone. "Hi," he began, then swallowed hard. "I used to walk past this garden every day on my way to school. I saw Mrs. Eleanor working here, making everything beautiful. But I never thought I'd be part of it." He looked around at the flowers they planted together, at the beds they designed, at the new students eager to learn. "Then one day, I stopped to help. And Mrs. Eleanor didn't just teach me about flowers. She taught me that beauty can grow anywhere, if you give it a chance. She taught me that kindness is like a seed. Plant it, and you never know what might grow." His voice grew stronger as he continued. Mr. Williams designed gardens that made people happy. Now, through this program, we can keep doing that. We can help other kids learn to create beauty, just like Mrs. Eleanor helped me. A butterfly landed on the podium as he spoke, its wings a brilliant mix of orange and black. People in the audience gasped softly at the timing. Thank you, Mrs. Eleanor, Marcus finished, turning to face her, for seeing something in me that I didn't even see in myself. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Marcus returned to his seat. Mrs. Eleanor hugged him tight, whispering, "Thank you for helping an old lady with her gardening." The mayor unveiled the bronze plaque, which read, "The Joseph Williams Memorial Gardening Program, founded 2024, where beauty grows and dreams bloom in memory of Joseph Williams, 1940 to 2010, master gardener, teacher, dreamer." After the ceremony, as people mingled and admired the garden, Marcus overheard snippets of conversation. "Can you believe how far he's come? Those designs are remarkable for someone so young. Joseph would have loved this." Mr. Peterson approached Marcus, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Listen, son," he said gruffly. "I was wrong about you. About a lot of things. I'm sorry." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, remembering what Mrs. Eleanor had taught him about grace. Later, as the crowd thinned, Marcus sat with Mrs. Eleanor on her porch. The setting sun painted the garden in golden light, making every flower glow. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About that first day," Marcus said, "when I stopped to help with the soil bag. Did you know then? What would happen?" Mrs. Eleanor smiled mysteriously. "I knew you had a gift. The rest," she gestured at the garden, the new students, the plaque. "The rest was just letting that gift grow." Marcus's mother joined them, carrying cups of lemonade. Ms. Rodriguez says Marcus could get a scholarship to study horticulture in college, she said proudly. "Can you imagine? My boy, going to college." "I can imagine," Mrs. Eleanor said softly. "I can imagine great things for Marcus." The three of them sat together, watching the day fade into evening. Butterflies danced through the garden, their wings catching the last rays of sun. New students chatted excitedly about their first designs. James discussed expansion plans with Ms. Rodriguez. Marcus looked at his mother, who no longer had to work 2 cleaning jobs thanks to the program stipend. At Mrs. Eleanor, who had become so much more than just a teacher. At the garden that had changed everything. "You know what Mr. Williams used to say?" Mrs. Eleanor asked, as if reading his thoughts. "He said that a garden is never really finished. It's always growing, always changing, always making room for new beauty." Marcus nodded, understanding. This garden, this program, this family they created, it would keep growing, keep changing, keep helping others discover their gifts. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, just as he had that first day. Mrs. Eleanor smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Same time tomorrow, dear. We have so much more to grow." As darkness fell, fireflies began to twinkle among the flowers, like stars come down to dance in their garden. Marcus thought about all the future students who would learn here, all the beauty they would create, all the lives that would change because one boy stopped to help one lady with her gardening. Sometimes, he realized, the smallest acts of kindness could grow into the most beautiful gardens of all.